Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for this exciting instalment of the International Affairs webinar series. As you'll know, International Affairs is Chatham House's academic journal, so a big welcome to both Chatham House members and International Affairs readers. My name is Leah Dehaan. I'm a junior editor for the journal and will be chairing today's webinar. I'm also the lead for International Affairs 50-50 in 2020 initiative. This is our public statement to strive for 50% of all our contributors identifying as women. Now, in pursuing this goal, we've also hoped to make a more holistic contribution to the conversation on women and gender in the international relations discipline. So for this reason, we have a blog post, a blog series, which looks at women, gender, and underrepresentation in IR. We've just published an in-depth analysis of the gender balance in the journal over the last three years. And most importantly, we are hoping to put a spotlight on the brilliant work on women and gender that International Affairs has been lucky enough to publish over the last few years. Now, no topic fits into this category better than the one we are discussing today, that of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So as you'll know, next month on the 31st of October, it will be 20 years since UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was unanimously adopted. While it is a cliche to call this a watershed moment, it has been key in highlighting the importance of women's participation in peace and security governance, as well as prioritizing women's protection in conflict. Now, despite the many shortcomings and blind spots, I think it's been fundamental to spotlighting women's needs and demonstrating that gender equality is a crucial building block for peace. In today's webinar, we will be reflecting on the last 20 years of WPS and perhaps further back to the historic movement that it draws on. All of this to look at the key changes that it has forced. This is included, amongst many other things, of course, the development of many national action plans, consideration of women's experience in conflict, and further resolutions, including, of course, related to conflict-related sexual violence. Now, as I mentioned, we must, as part of this, also scrutinize the key shortcomings in the realm of heteronormativity, the colonial legacies, and the uneven implementation of the agenda. All this so that we can draw lessons for the next 20 years and beyond. For this discussion, I cannot imagine being joined by a more qualified or better placed panel. First, we have Professor Sumita Basu from the South Asian University in New Delhi. Her brilliant work focuses on feminist international relations, the United Nations, and critical security studies. Second, there is Professor Paul Kirby from the LSE Centre for Women, Peace and Security. He is also co-director of the UKRI's Global Challenges Research Fund Hub on Gender Justice and Security, and his great work looks at the WPS agenda and feminist and gender theory with a particular focus on masculinities. Then last, but definitely not least, is Professor Laura J. Shepherd from the University of Sydney. She is also a visiting senior fellow at the LSE Centre for Women, Peace and Security, and the WPS agenda is her primary focus of research. Now, I know you do not need a reminder of the wonderful work of these academics, but I did just want to highlight a couple of things. First is the International Affairs 2016 special issue on women, peace and security, which Paul and Laura very kindly guest edited, and it includes contributions from all of today's speakers. Building on this, we've been very lucky to continue working with all three of our panelists in the form of several book reviews, Laura's recent special section on feminist IR and Mauritius Lusky's work, and Paul's brand new article on sexual violence in the border zone. Many of these articles are free to access, which is always great news, and I will make sure that there's links to all of these in the chat function. Next to that, I would be doing a disservice to my speakers if I didn't mention their brand new book. This is called New Directions in Women, Peace and Security, and I'm sure that we will touch on this in the discussion today. Now, before I stop rambling on, a couple of quick things. Today's event is on the record and it is being recorded. Second, after the opening remarks of our speakers, we'll hope to answer as many of your questions as we possibly can. You can submit these through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen, and you can also submit questions anonymously. So without further ado, let me hand over to Sumita Basu.
Thanks very much, Leah. It is a pleasure to join this conversation with you, Laura and Paul, and greetings to our global audience as well. Leah set out a few questions for us, so I'm just going to address these questions in the brief presentation. And the first question was about the focus of my work on women, peace, and security. And from the beginning, I have been intrigued by the idea of the Security Council adopting a resolution on women and peace and security. The tremendous work done by advocates notwithstanding, the tension between the institutional nature of the council and the concept of gender has shaped subsequent policies in important ways. And this issue has also been factored into much of WPS scholarship, including mine. For the last few years, I've focused primarily on two aspects. First, institutional politics relating to WPS, especially at the Security Council. And second, multiple meanings that WPS holds for practitioners and what this entails for the implementation of the agenda. Both these themes were reflected in my 2016 article, Gender as National Interest at the Security Council, which was published in the volume that Leah just mentioned. And I'll draw on this article and what I discussed there in my response to the next two questions that Leah set for us. The first of which was, how has WPS developed over the past 20 years and what has it lacked? Now, with 10 Security Council resolutions, and as of August 2020, as per the website maintained by the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the adoption of national action plans by 86 UN member states, or 45% of the membership. With all of this, we see a complex policy architecture holding up the WPS agenda. Importantly, this architecture can also be related to an increasing recognition by some states that a feminist foreign policy would be in their national interest. In its most famous Swedish iteration, such a foreign policy has been described as equal representation of women in international politics, ensuring women's equal access to resources, and ensuring respect for women's rights. But even without the use of this label, we have seen states engage with the WPS agenda in their foreign policy. Paul has written on former British Foreign Secretary William Hague's Preventing Sexual Violence initiative that informed Resolution 2106, sponsored by the UK, which became the first one to take note of sexual violence against men and boys during armed conflicts. Laura, in an article co-authored with Jackie True, has discussed Australia's references to WPS agenda in its successful bid for a non-permanent seat on the Security Council some years ago. Motoyama has examined Japan's embrace of WPS, while Ryan and Bassini have studied the international dimension of the national action plans of Liberia and Sierra Leone. There are many such examples of this. So considering the extent to which multilateral policies and their implementation are driven by state interests, these are promising signs. However, unsurprisingly, actions are not always matched by words. So specifically, I'd like to highlight 5 points here. First, in the foreword to our book, which again, Leah kindly mentioned, Anne-Marie Gates discusses the last round of US-Taliban talks in 2019, in which the US appeared much too willing to not include women in these negotiations on the presumption that Taliban would not want that. And yet, she goes on to note that Taliban actually was not opposed to this idea under certain circumstances. So this assumption was based on cultural stereotypes. Not all of it misplaced, but certainly not necessary in this particular case. Importantly, I mean, what we can draw out from this is that it becomes evident that women's participation, a key component of the WPS agenda, was of low priority. And we again see that across several case studies. Second, we see a fluctuation in commitments depending on leadership and ideology of the political party in power in specific national contexts. Some examples are more famous than others, but barring a few exceptions, commitment to gender issues in foreign policy has not been sustained. Third, and very importantly, there is the issue of funding, which I understand Laura would be touching upon as well. Fourth, we know that foreign policy making is fraught with compromises. There is a fine line in this particular case of WPS and gender issues more broadly. There is a fine line between gender mainstreaming and co-opting gender into business as usual. And here business as usual might mean something like sustaining wars with the argument that this is needed to done to protect women. This is an issue which comes up in our book a number of times. Sam Cooke and Lewis Allen, for instance, highlight the need to protect feminist spaces in these conversations. And finally, there is a need to take seriously the contentions around the WPS agenda as reflected also in the Security Council open debates. Some of these go to the heart of multilateral responses to the gender dimensions of peace and conflict. For instance, advocates in at least some parts of the world remain skeptical of policies associated with the Security Council in light of its institutional framework and history of selective interventions. So in the end, our work on WPS needs to inform and happen in conjunction with efforts to reform global institutions on peace and security and these larger efforts to secure sustainable peace. Coming to the final question, what am I hoping the future of WPS will look like? Well, at this time, my hopes are tempered, but I am very hopeful still. There will be continued attention on WPS, no doubt, for a number of reasons. But we also see that October 2020 is very different from October 2000. And not in the best possible sense. So in this current climate, my hope lies in the continued work of feminist advocates, working across different sectors and working at local and transnational levels. Some of these efforts, and this is my concluding point, that some of these efforts made by feminist advocates predate the establishment of the United Nations and should really outlast yet another churning in interstate relations that we are currently experiencing. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Samita. I'm now going to hand over to Paul Kirby.
Thanks so much, Leah. I'll just talk briefly about my most recent work, which Leah mentioned at the beginning, which has been on the European Union's approach to the women, peace and security agenda and how it interacts with the general strategy of deterring migration in collaboration with the recognized Libyan authorities, which I think in miniature can give us some purchase on the complexities and contradictions of WPS today, and maybe shed some light on both the past and future of the agenda. So the policy of the European Union towards migrants crossing the Mediterranean from Libya has for the last years been to effectively externalize the border of Europe. Search and rescue operations have been strongly restricted. EU military operations target people smugglers, and the Libyan Coast Guard, a force that is itself heavily infiltrated by militias and paramilitary groups, have been empowered to seize migrants and return them to Libya. Now, in Libya, an official department runs a network of detention sites where migrants are held indefinitely and in conditions that have been repeatedly described by UN offices and international agencies as inhuman. Now, it appears that the prison population has swelled significantly as a result of the EU's collaboration with the Libyan Coast Guard, as you would expect from a program of forced return. And a reasonable estimate is that somewhere between 5,000 and 20,000 migrants have been detained in official facilities at any given point in the 2017 to 19 period, with a relatively high turnover in the imprisoned population. Now, a growing body of evidence documents that sexual and gender-based violence against migrants moving through, detained in, or seeking to escape Libya is normal, commonplace, and so widespread that it affects almost all migrant and refugee women, which are just to give some quotes from recent human rights reports. And crucially, official detention facilities are themselves major sites of sexual and gender-based violence and significant nodes in a network of abuse. So at the same time that that is happening, the EU is generally regarded as a major ally of the WPS agenda and as having produced some of the better work on WPS in recent years. For example, the earliest EU policy on WPS from 2008 recognized the importance of protecting migrants and asylum seekers from sexual violence. And in the latest strategy of the Council of the European Union, the EU pledges itself to the gender-sensitive, quote, protection of refugees, internally displaced people, stateless people, and asylum seekers, end quote, across both internal and external policy, which is something we can maybe come back to. In the women, peace and security agenda more broadly, protection is often argued to be the dominant theme, and in practice heavily interpreted as meaning protection from conflict-related sexual violence. So of all the possible gendered harms associated with migration, one could reasonably expect that sexual violence would be the most visible to the EU, and a major objective of policy would be to prevent sexual violence crimes from taking place. And yet the record of EU WPS policy in regard to Libya suggests that survivors of sexual violence are instead excluded from meaningful concern. Now, despite a strong consensus on the evidence that sexual and gender-based violence is common in official detention, that it has been for years, and that it is integral to a system of extortion and abuse, the awareness of these abuses seems to have little impact on policy. So in my interviews for the piece in the most recent issue of International Affairs, and through my analysis of the existing policy, I found no connection between WPS and Libya policy in the EU in practice, insofar as it related to changing the approach that effectively feeds migrant detention. Instead, there has been some work on Libyan women's participation in the political process and on gender inclusion in security sector reform. But on violence against detained migrants, we have seen an outsourcing of almost all considerations around gender to external humanitarian and migration agencies, partly funded by the EU. And for reasons that I can go into later, these agencies face huge restrictions on their operation and only have capacity to evacuate a tiny number of detained migrants who are deemed most vulnerable in conditions where vulnerability assessments are patently inadequate and limited. Moreover, within the EU, there is a near total dominance of a trafficking frame, a kind of discourse around stopping human trafficking, instead of a human rights or gender violence frame. And we can see that in parliamentary debates in the EU and in the official positions of EU foreign policy. So along with others, I suggest that once the conflict-affected woman moves away from the war zone, she also crosses a boundary of recognition. And it is, of course, not only a she. Especially in detention, there is evidence that men suffer extensively from gender violence and sexualized torture. So migrants arriving in Libya from conflict contexts that would otherwise be recognized as likely sources of sexual violence now occupy a position in the border zone that alters their visibility in effect. And the positionality of migrants at different points of transit and confinement then affects how they are recognized in policy and practice, depriving them, I argue, of meaningful protection, and in a wider context, fueling the conditions that lead to abuses. So in some ways, this case exemplifies the complexities of the WPS agenda over the last 2 decades with regard to 3 common observations about the state of the agenda. The first is this idea of the implementation gap, right? So the agenda, read as the 10 Security Council resolutions, or more broadly, contains many promises across multiple themes. But where it is possible to measure progress, there has in general been little change since October 2000. So scholars and practitioners are therefore continually doing a kind of monitoring and evaluation work on the agenda and charting this gap. Second, it is often claimed that sexual violence has become the centerpiece of the agenda to the exclusion of other foundational objectives, such as the meaningful participation of women in decision-making and the move towards a break from militarism and towards the prevention of conflict more broadly. And I think many would say that the agenda has lacked or lost its more radical grounding. Though one implication of my research on the EU is that even with regard to protection, that most central pillar of the agenda, there is a deeply inconsistent commitment, and that even on the totemic issue of sexual violence, it is sometimes as if the agenda did not exist at all. And third, somewhat at odds with the idea of a narrow fixation on sexual violence, is that the agenda is growing and pluralizing, taking ever more issues into its remit. And many of the contributors in our edited volume look at those new horizons. For example, the intersection of women, peace and security and climate change policy. And although many of these issues do exist in the earliest statements of the agenda, they are today becoming more pressing and subject to contentious debates about what the agenda can or should do. So the question of what WPS means for migrant and asylum practices is one such area. So I think that starts to get us towards the idea of what the agenda has lacked in the last 20 years and what its shifting horizons might be like in the decades to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Just handing over to you now, Laura.
Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me to be here this evening. I'm in Sydney, Australia, so it is the evening, but welcome to our global audience, as Shumita said. It's really exciting to participate in this discussion. I'm actually going to pick up where Paul left off in terms of gesturing at the complexity of the WPS agenda, because I feel that any kind of discussion of how the agenda has developed over the last 20 years and what the futures or possible kind of vectors of development in the agenda over the next 20 years might look like really begin with an acknowledgement of complexity. The key focus of much of my research on the WPS agenda is on its policy architectures, and I really see these as kind of multi-layered and multi-sited. I've just recently concluded a project mapping narratives of WPS at UN headquarters in New York. But of course, as Shumita's work has pointed out, and as Paul has demonstrated through his analysis of EU politics, UN headquarters in New York is only one of the many sites at which the WPS agenda is being produced and reproduced through its practices. And much of my research really focuses on how the WPS agenda is formed and where, and how we know the agenda when we see it. And it was in part this complexity that the three of us tried to capture in our introductory chapter to our edited collection, where we conducted what we called a mapping in order to explore how the WPS agenda has developed over the last 20 years. And again, as I say, this complexity is a theme of much of my current and ongoing research. I think I would best characterize the development of the agenda over the last 20 years as having proliferated madly, and often with the various dimensions in tension with one another. And this, to me, points me towards a potential kind of avenue of inquiry, and the need to understand the different kind of local, regional and international cultures of women, peace and security. I think one of the things that recognition of complexity precludes or guards against is any sort of homogenizing move that sees the WPS agenda as a singular kind of a singular thing, a singular policy architecture that pulls in one direction all the time. And I think that what has developed over the last 20 years in conjunction with the agenda itself is a body of scholarship that explores the dynamics and the vectors of this change and complexity in really sophisticated and interesting ways. I think perhaps one of the only sort of unifying features of the WPS agenda at the present time is the idea that where we have WPS activity, we have tension and potential fault lines and potential moments of fracture. And I think that as scholars and practitioners, as advocates and supporters of the agenda, recognizing and sitting with this complexity can actually enable productive possibility in ways that we might perhaps not have thought 20 years ago. So essentially, I would suggest that the agenda has developed over the last 20 years in ways that lack coherence, but I don't see this as a problem or as a limiting factor. Quite the opposite, in fact. I think that there's possibility in acknowledging that the agenda itself is increasing in complexity, increasing in scope, and is multi-sited and potentially proliferating, as I said, in these somewhat contradictory ways. So in terms of Leah's question about what the agenda has lacked over the last 20 years, I would say that it has lacked coherence, but I don't see this as a limiting factor or a problem. But I would also pick up on one of the themes that Shumita gestured to and argue quite strongly that it has lacked adequate funding. Which brings me to my sincere hope for the next 2 decades of the agenda, which is in securing the necessary resources in order to see the continued work towards a just and sustainable peace at every level, whether this is within international organizations or at the very kind of grassroots level of community action towards women, peace and security principles. I think that we are seeing a reduction in funding opportunity, a reduction in space available for women, peace and security work. And I see that this is the most profoundly limiting factor for the agenda going forward. Resources are needed in order to keep going, in order to keep doing the work. I think over the last 2 decades, we've learned that it's a significant lack of funding for women, peace and security initiatives is a sincerely limiting factor. And now as 2 decades of women, peace and security work is drawing to a close, in the context of the near certainty of increased austerity measures worldwide in response to the pandemic-induced economic downturn, the question of sufficient and consistent funding is sharper than ever. It's important to resource directly the initiatives that are set out in the policy architecture that shapes and influences and informs the agenda in national, regional and international plans and guidelines. And it's also important as a way of signaling political will. The political commitment to women's rights and gender justice must be both underpinned and signaled by the investment of ongoing resources and the recognition of the significant amount of labor that has gone into the development and continued implementation of the agenda over the last 2 decades. One of the contributions to our edited collection, Shumita mentioned briefly, talks about holding feminist space. And I think over the next 2 decades, both seeking and securing resources for WPS implementation and the ability to hold feminist space are going to be significantly challenged. And I think that this is an area where we would all do well to conserve and pay attention. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much, and thank you all for these great opening remarks, which I think will frame the discussion perfectly. I have a couple of quick questions before we turn to the questions in the Q&A, and to our audience, please do make sure to submit any that you have. So my first question relates most strongly, I think, to Sumita's opening remarks. Who do you think, who is currently leading the WPS agenda? What countries do you think are coming to the fore in this? Is it civil society organizations? Who do you think have pushed the most changes over the last 20 years?
Should I go first? Okay, just very quickly, I mean, of course, if we look at the narratives on the implementation of, the passage of the WPS resolutions, civil society has absolutely had a central role to play. But something that has been discussed early on in the scholarship as well is that this could not have been done without the participation of states that were willing to be the pen holders or convince other less friendly states in the Security Council to agree to the to vote for these resolutions, and certainly the role played by advocates in earlier in UNIFEM and now in UN Women, that has been important too. So I think there are multiple players here, and we perhaps need to clarify as well that the civil society itself is very diverse, and that there are multiple meanings within civil society itself, and Some who are more radical are concerned about the instrumentalization of the agenda by those who talk about it in terms primarily of best practices, something that, again, one of the chapters in the book by Mariana Juhala and Mina Leitikainen, they discuss this issue. So yeah, I would say I mean, I'd use Laura's word here of complexity. There are lots of actors, and depending on what the issue area is, the leadership goes to sort of that constituency. Thanks.
Wonderful. I don't know if Paul, Laura, you want to touch on this?
Just to elaborate slightly on something that Shumita raised, which is sometimes the aspects of the agenda that we pay the most attention to, such as Security Council resolutions, are the ones that have least to do with the generation of new issues and concerns on the ground. And in particular, the way that states, as the agenda has grown and become more popular, states try and put their own stamp on, and sometimes that involves, for example, bringing forward a resolution where there isn't really a groundswell of demand for it. And we've seen the phenomenon of maybe what we could call hollow resolutions or empty resolutions, particularly in recent years, which are led by the states who happen to have a role in the Security Council in that particular cycle and want to put the stamp on it, but without a clear connection to something like guaranteed funding that Laura mentioned. So the question of agency has some of these layers as well.
Great, thank you very much. Just one last question from me. It sort of pertains to how you see the WPS agenda conceptualizing conflict. So as far as I can see, most of the national action plans locate it in areas where there is sort of ongoing violent conflict. And I was wondering whether you think that changes that are coming, or movements that are existing at the moment, including the Black Lives Matter movement, will be shifting this focus to center more on things like police violence, mass incarceration, and things like this. Laura?
Thank you. Maybe I'll make a few remarks in response to that very good question. I guess that there's two things that I would say. One is that I think it's potentially misleading to ask how the WPS agenda characterizes any particular aspect or element of its kind of remit, because I think one of the things that the work that we have done, both in the book but also kind of individually and together over the last few years, has shown that there are many different interpretations of what the WPS agenda is. And I think that this actually is illustrated really quite well in regard to the concept of conflict. And I think that different WPS actors, different WPS entities, and certainly different institutions have very different understandings of what conflict is, and also of what the solutions to violence are. And one of the pieces of work that I've just concluded is an investigation into the different logics of prevention that are offered within the resolutions alone, in terms of the different ways in which conflict is seen as a problem to be solved, and how different entities can engage in the prevention of conflict. And I argue that within the resolutions themselves, even, there are three distinct logics, and therefore three distinct ways in which conflict is thought of. I mean, I think a slightly more critical view, I think, is offered by Jamie Hagan and Tony Hastrup in the book that we've just published, where they talk about the implication of coloniality and the kind of ongoing issues within the WPS agenda around its complicity in terms of the perpetuation of particular types of violence and particular understandings of race and racialized violence. And I think that those limitations and difficulties are perhaps some that we have been slow to sit with as an intellectual community, and I would certainly encourage further consideration along those lines. But I guess as seems to kind of be the case, we often come back to this idea that it's complicated.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Sumita, Paul, I don't know if you wanted to jump in on that, or we can move on to the next question.
I'm happy to move on to the next one, thanks.
Perfect. So this is from one of our audience members called Trisha the Borchgrave. And I think this one is probably particularly directed at you, Paul, who asks, are EU policies on WPS agenda doomed to be undermined and under-implemented when there is no integral migration collaborative coordinated initiative on the migrant crisis from all EU states?
Yes. I mean, I think that's a good way of putting it. And the EU example is illustrative of some of the complexities that we've been talking about, precisely because I focus on the policy of the EU as an entity, which means the Office of the High Representative on Foreign Affairs and some of the collaborative stuff that comes out of the Council. But of course, member states have their own national action plans, which put different stresses on different issues. And at the national level, and presumably also at the sort of subnational level, those come into tension with the pressures of migration, with different kinds of attitudes. You know, you could just contrast the situations of Germany and Italy in the last couple of years with regard to the migration crisis, you know, the crisis of being a migrant and Europe's inability to deal with some of the outcomes of the war in Syria, for example, to see how those tensions would come into play. And as Sumita mentioned, you know, I think 86 countries now have a national action plan, but several of those have multiple national action plans, you know, each one superseding the last. And you can even track some of these changes at that level. So Italy has, if memory serves, 3 national action plans. And there are mentions of migration, asylum, and refugee policy in the first one, which drop out of the second and third. So, you know, within the architecture of the Italian state, clearly there's some kind of reconsideration or a caution around promising too much because of what it might commit the state to do. So clearly an integrated approach on migration would help, but that goes equally for an integrated approach on WPS protections. But it's a great question.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I've got another question here, which is from Paul Sherry, who asks, what can militaries do to improve training in WPS? Are there any militaries that can be upheld as examples to others? I don't know if anyone in particular wants to jump in on this.
I'm happy to make a couple of observations. This is not actually an area that I work in, so I'm one of the kind of limitations of my own knowledge in regard to the WPS agenda is the extent to which it's implemented in different ways in and within kind of national militaries and institutional cultures. But there is a lot of really very good research about gender training, particularly for militaries. And I guess rather than offering a kind of a good practice or best practice example, I would say that the most important thing seems to be, drawing on the existing research on this topic, the most important thing seems to be ensuring that gender training itself is well designed and is inclusive in design, and that the kind of the impact of the training is effectively monitored and evaluated. I think that there is some really excellent work being done at the Swedish Defence University on the ways in which gender training creates different outcomes, not only in terms of the observation of WPS principles, but also in terms of the ways in which troops then think differently about gender and justice and the principles of the WPS agenda more broadly. And so I guess it's not only about ensuring that people learn the rules of WPS, but more about understanding or kind of fostering cultural change and change in mindset, change in worldview. And I think that there's some of the most interesting work being done monitoring those kinds of impacts at the moment.
Thank you very much. Oh, yes, please, Sunita.
Well, just a quick addition to what Laura said, and again, this is not something that I've specifically studied beyond some research on UN peacekeeping forces, but the unfortunate aspect of some of the gender training is that it is donor driven. And so that then limits, which militaries are conducting this and what kind of gender training is taking place as well. So in some ways it goes to the heart of the sort of feminist engagement with militaries and what kind of militaries are the good militaries. I don't have an answer to that, sorry.
Thank you very much. I've got another question here, which I think touches on a couple of remarks that you made at the introduction, which is from Angela Rodriguez, who says, how do you feel about applying an intersectionality analysis to the WPS? This way one can see different violences experienced by different women, and I would, I guess, add to this, and different men during conflict in order to have more accurate plans. I don't know if, perfect, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is a really important and a really live issue. And I think that it's somewhat challenging for all of us to navigate, because obviously one of the key kind of pillars of the WPS agenda is the idea that the participation of women in peace and security governance is essential for the creation of just and sustainable peace. And that's a kind of a touchstone of the agenda and an awful lot of actions undertaken under the auspices of the agenda. But one of the difficult questions that is very rarely asked is which women we're talking about and what a difference it makes to have them involved in peace processes, in peace building, in peacekeeping, and all of the other actions that we might think of under the auspices of the WPS agenda. I think that historically the WPS agenda's advocates and supporters have been very sophisticated in their thinking about the different kind of intersections of identity, but unfortunately that sophisticated thinking very rarely translates to policy. And so what we get instead, particularly at the national level, are kind of clumsy references to diverse women in being included in peace processes. So I think there is a long way to go until we can say kind of with any degree of authenticity that all actors engaged in WPS are attending to gender as it intersects with other vectors of exclusion.
Do you want to go first, Paul, and then Samita?
Sure, yeah, just to follow up on that, I mean, I think intersectionality is an intriguing term because it can be used in both the narrow way that is often critiqued within the WPS agenda, so to come up perhaps with a better conflict analysis and have a neater understanding of which groups are most at risk of displacement or violence within somewhere like the Eastern DRC. But it also has this broader, much deeper, more structural analysis, which is more uncomfortable, I think, for WPS practitioners, but also for representatives of states and others. So, in Kimberly Crenshaw's original articulation, intersectionality wasn't just about a diversity of identity characteristics. It was about state structures and political structures and how they interacted to create vulnerability. So in Crenshaw's case, that was about anti-discrimination legislation in the United States, about how domestic violence shelters treated migrant women, and about citizenship criteria, right? So once we think about an intersectional WPS as having purchase on those issues, we get a much more radical critique of international society and of the state system and so on. So intersectionality can be subject to the same pressures of co-optation and instrumentalization as we see with other terms in the agenda.
Okay, thanks. I suppose the question of intersectionality is best explored at national and local levels because that is where we can really focus on what is meaningful in those particular contexts. So when the question of intersectionality came up, the first sort of national context that came to my mind was that of the Nepalese National Action Plan, which made a reference to widows, which is not, that was meaningful for that particular post-conflict society. And similarly, references to other kinds of experiences. And another way in which I increasingly have come to believe that intersectionality would feature in the kind of people or kind of advocates for WPS. So I was reading about the Korean National Action Plan recently, and the civil society actors engaged with it. And the kinds of civil society actors who wrote, for instance, their 1325 network, they're very localized organization, including one on housewives, one that looks at disability, very many different ones on sexual violence. So this idea of multiple sections of society actually engaging with the WPS agenda brings in intersectionality in from a different direction. And I think that is important.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think that's such an important question. So thank you all for these very comprehensive answers to it. We've got an anonymous question here, which changes tack slightly, which said, could we have an overview of the integration of the WPS agenda with climate change policies?
So this is actually just going to be an opportunity for me to plug some of the really brilliant research that is going on in this area, because this is not an area where I undertake any work myself, other than kind of tangentially through the UKRI, GCRF, Gender, Justice and Security Hub that you mentioned that Paul and I are both involved in, which among other things looks to map the connections between the WPS agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. And so the integration of WPS and climate change is squarely of interest there. But what I can do is to drop in the chat a link to a working paper that was published as part of the WPS working paper series that Paul and I edit, which explicitly engages the politics of climate change and the extent to which it has or has not been integrated in the WPS agenda by a researcher at the LSE Centre for Women, Peace and Security. And there's also a chapter in the new edited collection on this issue, which I can also drop the reference in the chat. But yes, I'm not going to attempt to summarize the research itself, but I'm happy to point you in its direction.
Perfect, thank you very much. So we have one question here from Amit Bali, who says, the most important challenge to the equal rights at all levels is the patriarchal mindset. If we really want to change this, we have to think and work honestly from the local level to the global level. And I was wondering if you'd be able to touch on this a little bit, particularly with maybe some examples where national action plans are being developed very much with the assistance of local civil society organizations.
So there are quite a few examples of national action plans being developed in consultation with civil society. Some of the first Asian ones like Nepal and Philippines would be very good examples, South Korea as well that I mentioned. And in fact, in several cases, the advocacy, the need for the national action plan itself is highlighted by civil society actors. And in the case of Nepal, for instance, it was a very bottom-up approach to the question of whether it's being then implemented. That I'm afraid it's a little bit more contested. but at the same time, I would say, you know, going back to the question itself, I'm not sure if there's only one direction in which this can happen. So local to global, but also I think that there's lots of, if you look at this idea of transnational advocacy networks, and how the different local nodes can actually connect to come up with international mechanisms that can then, as Keck and Sikking have pointed out, boomerang to particular parts of the world. I mean, those remain quite important. And so, yeah, I think it, and just one more point regarding, if you look at the WPS agenda, when 1325 was adopted 20 years ago, it actually was based on this, on a number of big campaigns, including one by International Alert, which I do not recall the exact name, but it actually said sort of from village to the negotiating table. I'm afraid I do not remember the exact title, but, and there were lots of local advocates involved. So they have very much been a part of it. But the extent to which that has made an impact on the big, you know, the big question of patriarchy, again, the implementation certainly has to be understood at the local level.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I don't know, Paul or Laura, if you want to jump in on this. Okay, so there's a question here from Catherine McKenzie, who says, UNSCR 1325 encompasses women and girls. In the UN and NGO sectors, how do you see children in armed conflict agenda and the WPS agenda interacting? Don't know who wants to jump in on this one first. I sense it's not an easy question. Laura, please.
I'm not sure that it's not a straightforward question. None of these things are straightforward, but I guess it's certainly at the limits of my kind of area of knowledge and where I might claim any kind of degree of expertise. But I think that there's interesting work being done that maps the connections between different protection agendas, including, and I use the word protection agenda in reference to the Security Council's work on the protection of civilians, which of course derives from international humanitarian law more broadly. And children and armed conflict is a space in which this work is happening. And what we're beginning to see, I think, is the emergence of these kind of discrete, bounded, separate sort of systems of governance that are nonetheless interrelated and interacting. And so children and armed conflict alongside the women, peace and security agenda have emerged and developed over much the same period of time. And what's happened more recently is the convergence of these two sort of threads or trends of peace and security governance in the form of the youth peace and security agenda, which of course is a discrete policy architecture of its own. And so again, while there's sort of all kinds of very smart people working on these particular topics, I guess what's interesting to me as somebody kind of who's a bit of a self-confessed sort of policy nerd is the ways in which the threads of each of these agendas coalesce and then go their separate ways and diverge and cohere in interesting ways and in interesting institutional forms across the UN and beyond. So I think that there are synergies between children and armed conflict and the WPS agenda, not least in the emergence of the youth peace and security agenda. But I think that there are also important differences as well, which I'm probably less qualified to talk on.
Thank you very much. Samita, Paul, if you want to jump in, let me know. Otherwise, I think we've reached our last question for today. I'm really sorry that we haven't been able to answer all of them, but we've just had so many. I'm hoping that I'm going to end on a slightly positive note. So Sita Padel Kamali asks, how do you think the state of discrimination against women has shifted over the last 20 years? In particular, what have some of the successes been of WPS in addressing violence against women? Who would like to start with this? Sumita?
Just that there has been a lot of institutional work on the issue of violence against women, including the special rapporteur on just the creation of the office of the special rapporteur on sexual violence against women. And as the as something that's been discussed before, in some ways the primary focus of the WPS agenda has been on protection and specifically this conflict-related sexual violence. So a lot of the funding has gone into it as well. So I do not have the statistics in front of me, but I would imagine that there are more institutional measures available to address this particular issue. At the same time, there have been something that Paul mentioned earlier, there have been some concerns that it may limit the scope of the WPS agenda as well, because initially, not so much anymore. I think there's a very sophisticated understanding of the protection agenda now, and had always been, but the dominant frame was that it presented women as victims. So we, in this engagement on the question of violence against women, it's also been important to make sure that women are presented as survivors in the process. That's it. Thanks.
And with regard to the agenda itself, I think we can maybe point to three kinds of progress. The first would be through the resolutions in the Security Council, the creation of new offices like the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Conflict-Related Sexual Violence, of which there have now been 3, and the kind of resourcing of that office in terms of a team of experts and other features, which has led to a higher amount of documentation, more interrogation of what's happening in conflict spaces, with all the problems that come with that. This fixation on sexual violence, the approach to a certain kind of conflict space as being exemplary. Nevertheless, that's something that didn't exist before the agenda did. Second, we could maybe take the case of how the agenda has supported and in some ways arguably accelerated what's happened in international criminal law. Again, there's a lot of critique around the criminal model of prosecution, and maybe what we might call a kind of carceral feminist approach to prosecuting the bad guys. But there are cases at the ICC which have had a checkered history, but tackling issues of sexual violence. And perhaps most positively of all are the connections that are starting to be built between the WPS agenda as a kind of conflict-focused agenda and CEDAW as the wider human rights framework for tackling violence and discrimination, including not in conflict zones, and challenging some of those conceptions. What is a secure or insecure space that Laura also touched on earlier? And there are people doing work on how CEDAW supports and extends WPS.
Wonderful. I don't know, Laura, if you wanted to touch on that final question. Perfect. I guess that is it for today then. Thank you ever so much, Sumita, Paul and Laura, for joining us for this webinar. I feel like I've learned a lot, and it's great to be able to answer the questions from the IA readers and the Chatham House members. Again, I should highlight the new book that you guys have out. So that's New Directions. I think Paul has put a link in the chat function. There it is. Great cover. So please have a look at that as well, because I know that in your answer you've drawn on a lot of the different chapters, so that demonstrates the variety of the work published in there. And of course in the chat you'll also have seen that my colleague Ben has put in lots of links to the IA articles that you will be able to find there. A lot of those are free to access, so do have a look.